Racism in Canada is super low key. Like, you won't even know it's happening unless you're the recipient of it. And it comes in many forms. Sometimes it'll come in a form of a microaggression. So like when someone tells me that I have nice hair for a black girl. Or you'll see it when there's just a lack of diversity in certain aspects of society. Like, why are all of the CEOs and board members of Canadian companies white? Or you'll feel it when you look at the inequalities of government spending. Like, every single politician wants to talk about affordable daycare for middle-class families, but then they don't want to fund clean water drinking programs for Indigenous communities. Like, it's 2020 and Indigenous communities are still boiling water. So racism in Canada is very covert, it's very under the table in comparison to how it operates in the United States, but that just means that we have to be super vigilant and aware in order to recognize racism and then call it out in order to stop it. This is Q&A, but Canadian. Welcome to Q&A, where I talk about things you won't learn in school. My name is Cheyenne, and today's question is, what is systemic racism? What systemic racism means is that our social and political institutions of our society work together in order to discriminate against a group of people based on their race and the associations and preconceived conceptions that go along with the color of their skin. So systemic racism doesn't just mean that black people are treated poorly, it also means that white people are treated at a higher standard than other races in our society. So systemic racism means that every race is treated differently because of their color of their skin, and that could be both negatively or positively. So when slavery was abolished in Canada in 1834, it wasn't like John the slave owner looked at George, who he owned as a slave yesterday, and was like, hey George, let's go for a drink because we're all created equally now. Like, that was not the case. What happened was over 100 years of segregation in Canada, and our government and its agencies were used to keep segregation in place. So systemic racism was used to keep black people separated from white people. So systemic racism in Canada started off with slavery. It started off with this idea that white people are superior to black people, therefore it is natural for white people to own black people as slaves. Then this idea reinvented itself in the years of segregation, so that the idea was it is normal for white people to live in nicer neighborhoods, to sit in the nice seats in the theater, to receive a better education, and to get better paying jobs because they are superior to black people who are inferior. So what I'm gonna do is take three areas of the government: education, homeownership, and businesses, and show how these ideas that have been passed on since slavery and segregation in Canada are still affecting us today in our society. So let's talk about education. In Ontario and in Nova Scotia, it was legal to segregate public schools. So what that meant was that a white kid could go to a white school, and then black kids could be denied acceptance into these white schools because of the color of their skin. So how did this work? Well, in 1850, Ontario had the Common Schools Act. And in this act, there was a clause called the Separate Schools Act. And what the clause said was that if a parent wants a separate school board for their kid to attend, the government would help them create that school board. So what this was intended for was that if a Catholic parent wanted their Catholic child to go to a Catholic school and not mingle with a bunch of Protestant children, then the government would help them create a Catholic school board. Or if a French-speaking family wanted their French-speaking kids to go to a French public school and not mingle with English kids, the government would help them create a French public school board. So that's what it was intended for. But what it was also used for was for white people to go to the government and say there should be a black school board, and then force black children to attend the black school board. Never mind that no black parent asked for a black school board. So what happened was a white school trustee went to the government and said there should be a black school board, and the government was like, yeah, that's fair. And then they created a black school board. So if you were black, you had to go to the school board, because once it was created, it was enforced. This is how schools were legally segregated in Ontario and Nova Scotia. But in the other provinces, this didn't really exist. So technically, a black kid could attend a white public school. However, there were so many angry white parents who threatened the black families with violence that they just felt it was safer to go to a black public school. So Ontario's last segregated public school closed in 1965. 1965! That means Ontario was 98 years old when it decided that there shouldn't be segregated public schools. The last segregated public school in Nova Scotia closed in 1983. That means Nova Scotia was 116 years old when it decided segregated public schools were a bad idea. This happened in our parents' lifetime. Segregated schools in Canada existed in our parents' lifetime. Okay, so you're probably wondering, like, yeah, it's terrible that these Black kids had to go to segregated public schools, but at least they all received the same education, right? Public schools in Canada were funded through property taxes. So if you go to a Black public school in a Black neighborhood where the value of the property is less than white neighborhoods, you're receiving a lesser education. Schools in white neighborhoods offered a higher education because they could collect more funding from higher value property taxes. Funding schools only with property taxes is systemic racism because you're using home ownership to determine the level of education that each student gets. This funding scheme of funding public schools through property taxes existed in Ontario until 1998. So 25 years ago, our governments decided that, you know, maybe using property taxes to fund schools sort of leads to inequalities. So they changed that. Now they have a different system where the Ministry of Education determines how much money each school board needs to operate. The government will say, okay, 30% of property taxes collected by a city goes to education. So that's a flat rate. And then the difference between the operating budget and the property taxes, the government will fill from their spending. So this hybrid way of funding schools with property taxes and government spending sort of equals out the playing field so that if you live in a neighborhood with poor property value, you can still receive the same education because the government is topping up different school boards' budgets. So when I talk about being vigilant about racism in Canada and being able to recognize and be aware of it, defunding schools is one of those situations, because when a government starts talking about having less money for school systems, it's sort of like they want to push us back to a system of using property taxes to fund schools. And now we understand why that's problematic. So the second way that our government was used to segregate Black people from white people is through land ownership. So before I even continue, there's a tiny little bit of tidbit information that I should probably mention before we talk about land ownership. All of the land that England was dividing up and parceling up and giving to different people was land that they stole from Indigenous people. So let us not forget. So remember when a bunch of angry Americans got pissed off about paying taxes to England, and so they threw a bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor? That started a war because you don't mess with England and their tea. So a bunch of angry Americans started rioting and burning stuff. Sound familiar? And they took the American colonies from British rule. And then they invaded Canada, and England was not trying to lose the Canadian colonies along with the American colonies. So what they did was recruit a lot of loyalists. So they were looking for white Americans who supported the crown and wanted to move to Canada and fight against the rebellious Americans who didn't support the crown. And they also looked for Black loyalists. And these were enslaved African Americans in America who were promised land in Canada and freedom if they fought alongside England in the Revolutionary War. Obviously, if you're a slave and the country that enslaved you is now saying, hey, we'll give you freedom and land if you fight against these rebellious Americans, like, that's a no-brainer. So England was able to keep the Canadian colonies, and a lot of the loyalists then moved to Nova Scotia. So there were Black loyalists and white loyalists, and each were promised land. But when it came to giving Black loyalists their land, it was always smaller portions of land in comparison to white loyalists, and it was often in areas that were of lesser value than where white loyalists would get their land. Go figures. Black loyalists who came to Nova Scotia, they got their land and created a community called Birchtown. So this is an area where it was mostly free Black people living, and it was separate from Shelburne, which was a county where a lot of white loyalists got their land. You might have heard of the Tulsa Massacre. This is when angry white people burned down the Black Wall Street of Oklahoma. If you know about that event and it made you wonder if Canada had an equivalent event, that would be the Shelburne riots. So there were a lot of white loyalists who ended up in Shelburne, but the government was really slow to give them their land that they were promised for fighting against the Americans. So while they waited for their land, they had to hire themselves out and offer to work for other people in the city to make money and survive. This was a little problematic because there were also free Black people in the neighboring town, Birchtown. And these Black loyalists would also hire themselves out to work, but they did so at a cheaper rate than the white people. So these white people got upset. They were upset that they couldn't make money. They were upset that they didn't have their land. They were upset that these Black people had land and had money because they were willing to work for wages that white people just deemed unacceptable. So in similar fashion to Tulsa, they went into the house of a Black preacher and burned it to the ground. And then they moved on to neighboring Birchtown and burned that to the ground. So So these riots lasted for about 10 days before the military came in to restore order. But restoring order wasn't bringing back the Black loyalists to the land that they were promised and given. It just meant calming down the angry white people. In what I've read so far, I don't even know what happened to the Black loyalists and where they went after their city was burned down. The Shelburne riots are actually the first recorded race riots in North America because it happened 137 years before Tulsa. Whoever told you Canada always copied America. The similarities between Tulsa and Shelburne is just this idea that white people had that they can just take whatever they want. If they want indigenous lands, they'll take it. If they want the land or the communities that Black people built by themselves, they'll take that too. The most recent example of this is in 1962 with Africville in Nova Scotia. Yes, no joke, in Nova Scotia, there was a community called Africville because, you guessed it, it was all Black people. So this was a Black community built from scratch, and I'm not exaggerating, I mean literally built from nothing. So these Black people paid taxes to the city, but the city provided them no services to help them build their communities. There was no electricity, no drinking water, no sewage, no garbage pickup. There were no roads to go into the village. The closest road ended 100 meters from it. There were no schools and there were no transportation services. So even though they paid taxes, the government did nothing to provide them with government services. So this community was literally built from scratch. So as Africville was developing, the city built a nearby prison and a nearby sewage facility. And then they labeled Africville a slum. So when I talk about Black people living in areas where they have low property value. So then in 1962, the city had a change of heart and they decided that they actually needed Africville for industrial development. And they gave the people living in this village 5 years to move out. So literally in 1967, the city came with bulldozers and was literally demolishing the city as people slept in their bedrooms. They had to relocate at their own expense in 1967. But that's Nova Scotia. On the other side of the country, in 1968, there's actually records of property forms where there's a clause that says if you buy this house, you promise to not sell it or rent it to a Black person, Indigenous person, Asian person, or Jewish person. There's a clause. So if you don't agree to this clause, you cannot buy the house. So that's how systemic racism worked in home ownership. City planning and home ownership were used to determine where Black people could live. Even if you were a Black person that could afford to live in a nicer neighborhood, no one would sell you their property. You couldn't move there even if you wanted to. That's why we have communities today that are predominantly Black and predominantly Indigenous, because those were the only areas that they were legally allowed to live. And now these areas have lower property values and receive less government services because of the history of why they exist. So remember when I said that Black kids going to a segregated public school would receive a weaker education because their schools were funded through property taxes? Well, the type of education they received didn't really matter because no matter what education they had, they were going to only work in service sector jobs. So even if they did well in school, went to a university that even accepted Black people, and then graduated, the only jobs they would get is service sector jobs. But why is that? Well, the idea behind slavery was that Black people are naturally inferior to white people, therefore it is okay for white people to own Black people as property. That idea reinvented itself in segregation as Black people are naturally inferior to white people, so the only jobs that they are suitable for are jobs that are in service to white people. So the only jobs that Black people could get are waiter jobs, waitresses, laundry people, porters, so people that handled luggage on trains and hotels, janitors, factory workers, maids. Those are the only jobs available to Black people. So this is systemic racism, using employment to treat people differently based on the color of their skin. When labor unions were fighting for better working conditions, that didn't include Black people. When they won the right to only work 8 hours a day, that did not include Black people. Black people were still working 10, 12, even 15-hour day shifts. Again, using political institutions to treat people differently based on the color of their skin. It wasn't just hiring practices that were systemically racist. Businesses could pick and choose who they served and who they didn't serve based on the color of someone's skin. So if a Black person wanted to go to the theaters, they could only sit in areas that were just for Black people. Even if they could afford a ticket to sit in the white section, they weren't allowed to sit there. Why do you think there's so many Black barbers? because white people refused to cut black hair. But man still needed a lineup. Businesses could refuse to serve black people in a restaurant because they were black. Going to the swimming pool, going to a skating rink, going to a park was also segregated. And if white people felt uncomfortable, they could call the police and have black people removed. Just like our girl, Amy Cooper.
There is an African-American man. I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
But don't think that black people just sat down and took it all those years. Black people in Canada have always fought for desegregation and equal rights and freedoms in public spaces. They held meetings, they held demonstrations, they signed petitions, they lobbied politicians, they wrote articles in media. They took their kids out of publicly segregated schools and forced them to go to white schools. They sat in at restaurants, they sat in offices of politicians. They filed lawsuits and sued institutions that were practicing segregation and then pooled their money together to help those people who brought their suits to the court. And it took a lot of small changes in order to get to where we were today. First, it started in Ontario, where it said no business or service or government institution could hang a sign that said they openly discriminated against people of color. Then a law was passed that any business using a license issued by the city who practiced segregation would have their license revoked. And then an employment law passed where you could not discriminate against someone for hiring based on the color of their skin. So these laws passed in Ontario were then passed at a federal level until the 1980s when Canada got its second constitution and ended segregation in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So in every one of these small victories that black people won throughout the years of segregation in Canada, it took a white person in power to listen to them and agree with what they were saying and pass laws to change their experiences. If every black Canadian that sued a school board for not letting their kid sit in a white class or sued a business for not serving them went to a judge who ruled against them, there would be no change. Those judges, those white judges, had to listen to these black people and listen to their experience and say, you know what, our laws do not support this and we need to change our laws in order to provide an equal experience for black Canadians. That's why it's so important for white people to listen to black people, listen to their experiences, and recognize where they have spheres of influences to change realities in our country. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of small victories to affect large systematic change, but we've done it before and we can do it now. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you subscribe to stay up to date on all the news you've ignored, and I'll see you next time.